record button. And I think we're recording. So I'll re-welcome everybody to this March 27th class. We had just gotten started before I realized I hadn't hit the record button. And we were about to do a quick review of the course requirements. So this is for those doing the class for license renewal. And I pulled up kind of our abbreviated rubric here just to review what needs to be done. And so you can see a couple of things here. There were those SDI, Specially Designed Instruction, online modules that we had asked people to complete. And the reason for that was to supplement the time that we spent talking about the SDI model back in the fall. And actually that added a few additional hours of class time to the course to get us to where we needed to be for that credit. And so just a reminder that if you're doing it for license renewal, you would have needed to complete those online. I believe most of you did, and you sent me your certificates, and so I've been keeping a record if you finished those. If for some reason you didn't, you can do that now. Those are the modules that are on AAPD online. There's directions on the course page on how to get there, and so just a reminder that those need to be done. Most of you have them done already, but if you haven't, you can still catch up with that. Then at the bottom here, there was that requirement to attend all 9 online video conference sessions. But we did, before anybody panics, we had communicated to everybody that if you did have to miss a session, we were recording these, and we asked you to watch the video, to go through that material. And then there's that reflective response form on the course page where you would just kind of self-report, say, yes, I viewed it, and submit kind of a brief reflection on what you saw, what you learned there. So that attendance and or makeup. And then right here in the middle, we haven't talked too much about, except for way back in the fall. And I don't want anybody to feel like this is a heavy assignment, because it's really not intended to be. It's just meant to be kind of a reflection piece for you. So we're asking you at the end of the course, and I would say our last session is on April 16th. So let's say by the end of the month, by April 30th, if you could submit to us just 2 brief reflections, and we do mean brief reflections. And you can see the description there, selecting 2 IEPs that you author, that you're responsible for, and write a brief reflection indicating any areas of IEP development that could be improved. So just asking you to look at your own IEPs and kind of reflect on how you think they are as far as meeting compliance indicators. And also, the second bullet would like you to reflect on specifically how you were delivering SDI to those students and how you were using progress monitoring data for decision making. Everybody kind of remembers we tried to take a little bit of time in the fall to really focus on those components. Just what does good SDI look like for our kids with disabilities, and how can we know that they're improving by using decision making and progress monitoring. So write a brief reflection. Now there is that reference to that compliance checklist, and I want to show you what I'm talking about. That's just a reference point, not asking you to physically score your IEP. We actually do that in the IEP class for new teachers, but just sort of a point of reference. And what that is, I've relinked that up here so that it's easy to find, hopefully, on our participants page. There's, see where it says rubric for license renewal. That's what I was just having you look at. And there's this compliance checklist. If you go there, that is simply this. And this might look familiar to some of you, because this is really kind of a slightly reformatted version of what used to be the state ISTAR checklist. And it's simply, some of this is still being used for those secondary transition IEPs, but what you've got here are just some really key compliance kinds of things. So when you look at an IEP, If you can answer yes to all these questions, who are the right people that are attending? Did you include preference and interest for the students? Looking at the post-secondary expectations. It will ask you questions about your goal. Do you have a well-written goal that can be monitored? So there's all these indicators, and so for these brief reflections that you're going to write on 2 IEPs, we would just ask you to reference this and say, okay, here are some key indicators of compliance. How am I doing? Did I spot anything that I think I should improve upon as a veteran educator? So to reflect on that, and also this idea of how was SDI delivered? How did my monitoring go? Using progress monitoring tools and that type of thing. So that's really what we would ask you to do. Pick 2 IEPs and submit to Angie and I those reflections. And Angie and I do have access to the web IEP system and multiple districts. So if you submit your reflections and you have a student name and district, we would be able to pull those IEPs up and take a look at those as well. There's not a plan to do a real hardcore inspection, but we may, if we see some things, we may have an opportunity to give you some feedback or share some things with you. So in other words, you can just turn your reflections in with the student name and district, and we'll have access to those IEPs along with you. So that, just wanted to kind of review that. So our last class will be April 16th, and then if those of you doing license renewal would be able to have those assignments into us by the end of the month, that would be wonderful, and we can get credit in and transcripts out and all that good stuff that some of you may need for licensure requirements. And any questions about all that I just said here, and then I can stop talking.
Just want it submitted, like email it to you or share a Google Doc or?
Yeah, great question. Electronically, please. It would be, it could be either one. You could just do it in an email. Sharing a Google Doc would be great, but yeah, it's going to be simplest if you send that to us electronically. And I'm thinking if you would email it to Angie and I, we can kind of, we can kind of collaborate on, taking a look at those and maybe getting you guys some feedback. So yeah, if you would just share that electronically in whatever way works best for you, email or sharing would work just great. And again, not a real heavy. We don't want this to be a real laborious thing, but it's just looking at those compliance indicators, thinking about instruction and monitoring, and just having you reflect on how do you think your IEP development has gone. Just an opportunity for professional reflection and maybe bringing in some things that you took in as part of going through this veterans class.
Sandy, if you're trying to talk, you're muted. I just see your lips moving.
Thank you. I was trying to talk. Thank you. Ron, I did email you those SDI module certificates. I just never heard back if you received them. So I was hoping I did it right.
Okay, Sandy, and thank you. And I remember when you emailed me that, and let me take a look to make sure they did come through. And if not, don't panic, because when you complete them, your certificates kind of live in that AAPD online. They kind of archive them there, and they're there. So if for some reason they didn't come through in the email, it shouldn't be hard to go back and grab them. But I'll make a mental note to check on that, because I'm sorry, Sandy, because I remember you had asked me to check on that, and I don't think I did. So I will take a look.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right, I think unless there's other questions about those, we should probably jump into our content for today. And Angie, I think you were going to kind of start us out. If you want to maybe share on your end, let me unshare.
I can do that.
And I'll let let's see. There we go. Okay.
I can give it the old college try, right? All right, so here we are, next to the last day. Let's see. All right, so one of the things that we wanted to talk about, this is a kind of a carryover from last time where we talked about discipline procedures and manifestation termination, was this idea that there are some kids that have protections under IDEA that don't yet have an IEP. And so before we go into a lot of detail, I'm interested to know if anybody in Zoom land has ever had a situation where parents have called the question when you've tried to do some kind of disciplinary action and waved that flag and said, hey, I think my kid has a disability. Has anybody had that occur for them? Nope. Well, you're lucky. It just makes it a little more challenging. So you can find this information beginning on page 217 of your procedures manual for the 2018-19 school year. But as it says here in the slide, students not yet eligible might be able to assert those same protections under IDEA if the LEA had knowledge that the student was a student with a disability before that behavior that precipitated the disciplinary action. So that's kind of interesting. So you've got a kiddo that did something the school district wants to suspend or expel, and mom or dad comes back and says, hey, wait, you should have known my child had a disability, so you cannot do this. So had knowledge, what does that mean? The procedures manual lays that out. Oops, sorry, I'm just really struggling. Okay, here we go. I think I got it. All right, so so what we know are there are really three kind of things that we need to consider. If prior to the behavior, and that's important because sometimes we will get parents that call a foul after the behavior, after the discipline is ready to be handed down. But prior to the behavior, if the parent expressed a concern in writing to the LEA that their child was in need of special education, and that's kind of a, and I don't know how Ron would weigh in on that one, but you know, some of our parents aren't necessarily able to articulate very well. They don't really know what to ask for or how to ask for it. And so it might become a matter of semantics. Did they give it to us in writing or did they just talk about it? And so I think, you know, legally, if a parent has expressed a desire before the behavior that they believe their child has a disability, an administrative law judge or an attorney could come back and say, well, you should have known, given the intellectual ability or whatever of the parent, that they were requesting an evaluation. They felt like their child had an IEP. So in some cases, I think it being in writing isn't going to hold water for in certain cases. So Ron, would you agree with that? We didn't get a chance to talk about this too much, but what do you think about the parent who isn't able to put their thoughts down in writing and this particular part of the procedures manual?
Yeah, it does get to be a little bit of a gray area, but I think, you know, some of the litigation that's been out there, you know, they use that rule of reasonableness. You know, would a reasonable person, you know, or should have a reasonable person have assumed that the student, you know, to suspect a disability. You know, so if there's a case where, you know, you could use behavior as an example, and sometimes they do it at these law conferences, you know, if the student was demonstrating dramatic behavioral concerns or dramatic academic delays, you know, things like that.
Right.
You'd say, gee, you should have known, even though you can't produce for me a letter. You know, the parent said, I'm requesting an evaluation, and you should have done that. So
right.
It gets a little gray, but it kind of, you know, talks in terms of, you know, rules of reasonableness.
Yeah, there was definitely an expression that they felt like their child needed special education. So,
Right.
Just to err on the side of they expressed it, we probably should move forward. Or if the parent actually requested an evaluation of their child. So they expressed a concern their child might need special education, or they said, I want an evaluation of my child. And again, it occurred prior to the behavior. And the third thing, which is a little more difficult, I think, to figure out in some cases, is that the LEA expressed concerns about the pattern of behavior to members of the LEA or AEA.
Angie, I just noticed, I'm realizing I don't think your screen is moving. We're just still seeing that intro. For some reason, it didn't change the slide.
Okay.
Your slides aren't moving, in other words.
Sure. Let's try here. Is that better?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. All right. Good deal. Well, I was having a little trouble anyway, so thanks for mentioning that. So The third one is that the LEA expressed concerns about the pattern of behavior to members of the LEA and AEA. And this one is a little more gray, I'd say, than the other two. What does that look like? And as I think about it, I think of, a classroom teacher that has indicated to a principal or to a counselor, this child has some really bad behaviors. I wonder if maybe he should be on an IEP. I mean, that's kind of an obvious kind of thing. So a teacher has expressed this to someone, and then the child has this behavior. This kind of smacks of the district should have known that the child might be a child with a disability. So if those things occur, they could have those protections under IDEA. Exceptions to that would be, you've requested an evaluation. The school has said, we feel like this child might have a disability. We'd like you to sign consent for this evaluation. And the parent says, nope, not going to happen. I'm not going to sign that. No, there's no obligation on the district's part to assume that this child has a disability at that point, so they can move forward with that disciplinary action. Or if the child was evaluated, and it doesn't say when, but I'm assuming it means somewhat recently, within the past maybe 3 to 6 months, the student was evaluated and determined not to have a disability. So you've done your due diligence as an IEP team, you've looked at all the data, you've determined the child's not eligible, doesn't have a disability, so they're no longer covered under those disciplinary provisions of IDEA. Or you have a kiddo that was in special education and the parent has since revoked consent for services. I don't want my kiddo in special ed anymore. Your exit code for the student would be PRC, which stands for Parent Revoked Consent. The district's under no obligation to consider this child as being eligible, so you can move forward with your disciplinary processes. They wouldn't be protected under IDEA for those. Anybody have any questions about those? I would say we don't see these happening very often. I can remember in the past, and some of you maybe who have been around for a while might have experienced this, but with the zero tolerance rule, for example, on having weapons on the premises. When hunting season comes around and there's a big old rifle or shotgun in the back of the truck because the student's going hunting after he gets out of school. Well, that's obviously a violation, and zero tolerance policies could be grounds for expulsion. Then you have a parent come and say, oh, I think my child has a disability. I want him evaluated for special education. So that would be something that I have heard of in the past, but we just don't see this a lot. But it's important to know, just in case it happens, so you can guide your principals now that you're in the know. Did my slide change, Ron?
Yes, looks like we're good.
All right. So that was basis of knowledge. So we're thinking here that in the previous slide, the district should have had knowledge, and then we saw the exceptions. And so this is where we talk about how the district shouldn't have had any basis of knowledge. So you can see here what it talks about in the procedures manual. There's no previous knowledge that the student had a disability prior to the behavior. the student can be subjected to the same disciplinary measures. Okay, so we've never had any concerns about the child. Nobody's expressed anything. The teacher hasn't, the parent hasn't. So we don't have to worry about discipline provisions for these kiddos. We can just do our normal kind of disciplinary action. So here we get into what I was talking about next with this student who had the rifle. If during the time period of disciplinary action, the parent requests an evaluation. So it does become a little tedious sometimes, but you're required to conduct an evaluation in an expedited manner. And so I think, Ron, when we look at this piece, while we should follow the disability suspect process, more than likely, no matter what the decision of disability suspect, we're probably going to move on to an evaluation. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah. That's kind of our general recommendation when there's a, in cases like this or when there's a direct parent request, yeah.
Yeah, oftentimes, if you have enough data for like an academic referral and you get to disability suspect where parents been recommending and requesting an evaluation, and you go over the information and they're fine with that, you wouldn't move on to an evaluation. But in cases where it's contentious or, when in doubt, you go ahead and evaluate. So until complete, so you have to do that evaluation in an expedited manner. And I don't recall that the procedures manual says how long. Normally we would have 60 days. So I'm thinking, 30 days maximum. So until that's complete, the student is in placement determined by the LEA, which could include suspension or expulsion without educational services. If you find that that child's eligible after the evaluation is done, then special education related services must be provided, just like you would with any student who has a disability that's been expelled or suspended for more than 10 days. So they can progress in the general curriculum and make progress towards their IEP goals. But they can remain in that expulsion or suspension setting. What questions do you have? Sometimes I'm better at wait time than others. All right, well, let's move on. Open enrollment. How many of you have had students with IEPs that try to either open enroll into your district or who try to open enroll out of your district? Some of you had some of those? Okay. The majority of those for us occur at Iowa Connections Academy, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we do, and we had a process in place where we do that, and now it's made it into the procedures manual where there's some steps that you're supposed to follow if a student with an IEP tries to open enroll into your district. First of all, March 1st is the deadline for open enrollment, and that has passed. So likely your district would not be getting any other open enrollment requests for next year unless there's a good cause exception, and I won't go into all of that. But March 1st is the deadline for children ages are in 1st through 12th grade. If they are going to be in kindergarten, that date is pushed back to September 1st. So a kindergartner could apply for open enrollment to your district on, August 29th, and you would be obligated to review that. Preschoolers, only preschoolers with an IEP can request open enrollment. If a preschooler does not have an IEP, open enrollment would not apply to them because preschoolers generally can enroll in any preschool anywhere. And that would be like a 4-year-old in the voluntary 4-year-old program. That preschool student can open enroll in the voluntary program in any district. So that's not an open enrollment situation. So March 1st is that deadline, and now it's time to start reviewing the IEP. And there's an obligation of the potential receiving district to consider, can we provide FAPE to this student if they came to our district? And we do that through review of the IEP and consultation with the resident LEA and AEA. So the receiving AEA and district set up a meeting with the resident district and AEA. And what we do is it's not an IEP meeting, no decisions, about services or anything are made at that time. It's just, can we provide the services in this IEP in our receiving district? And so we review the IEP, we have a conversation with the resident district, and we try to make that determination. I can tell you I had about 13 of those meetings on Monday with Iowa Connections Academy, because we get a lot of students that try to open enroll to Connections Academy, and quite a few of them have an IEP. And I have one more tomorrow with another district that they're trying to open enroll into one of my districts that I serve, and so I set up that consultation with the resident district and AEA. So if the receiving district feels like they're not able to provide a free and appropriate public education, you've looked at the goals, you've looked at the behavior plan, you've looked at the accommodations, you've looked at all of that, and you're just like, there's no way we can do this. You have to provide a prior written notice to the parent discussing the denial. Why are you denying that? And you have to provide them with their procedural safeguards. So that's kind of that process. And we do have, if anybody's interested, we do have a Google Doc that has a number of resources and links in it, and sample letters and sample prior written notices in it. So if you're in a situation where that's occurring, just let us know and we can provide that to you. Or maybe we could have Ron link that on the participant page. Let's see, it seems like there was something else I wanted to say about that. Not ringing a bell. One of the cautions that we have is if a district does not go through this process, and we've had this occur, if the district goes through this process and accepts a student and then looks at the IEP and realizes there's no way we can provide this service, this isn't a nice term to say, but you're stuck with that kid. Open enrollment will only end if the parent revokes that. So if this child, if Ron open enrolls into my district and I didn't do my due diligence looking at that IEP, I'm stuck with Ron and trying to figure out how to support the needs in this IEP. And if I can't do it, I'm going to have to find another district that can provide that service. And in some situations, because of the kind of the contiguous nature of the open enrollment request, we've had cases where the district, the receiving district, looks to the resident district to provide the IEP services because they can't. And, parents have open enrolled that family to the receiving district for a reason. And it's not because they want to be in the resident district anymore. So it's, make sure you do your due diligence. What we typically do is anytime we get an open enrollment, we search the IMS system, and you can have a regional administrator such as Ron or I. You can have the IMS secretary such as Joni Fink or Karen Schwenke or, Faith. Any of those people can take a look to see, was that child on an IEP? And if so, you need to review them. So yeah, if you accept them and FAPE cannot be provided to an accepted student, then you may have to seek placement elsewhere. And you certainly, that's kind of a headache, and you don't want to get into that if you can't. You don't have to. So this kind of piggybacks on that with the virtual school, which is not homeschool. Sometimes we see in an IEP on the prior written notice page, it will say, parents are going to homeschool their child at the virtual academy. Well, it's not a homeschool. It's a part of the public school system, if you will, because it's connected to a public school. In this case, ours is CAM Community School District. And sometimes we will see in a prior written notice that The IEP will be discontinued because the parent is choosing to put their child in the virtual school. Well, it's not a parent choice necessarily because of what I said just a few minutes ago relative to the receiving district needing to review the IEP to determine if it's FAPE. You certainly could put, that the parent is looking into the virtual school, but don't put in the prior written notice that the child's going to the virtual academy unless they've already been accepted. I have a virtual school. They have to follow all open enrollment guidelines. Be careful what you put on the prior written notice. I just said that. One of the things that we run across sometimes is the exit code on the IEP. So we get a number of cases where the parent maybe has decided to homeschool the child and then they try to open enroll their child later. And so we always look at the exit code and the prior written notice when we're looking at these kiddos. And if it's a CPN code, which is competent private instruction, that child retains eligibility. So we are obligated to review that IEP, even if they've been off of an IEP. Like we just had one Monday that had been off of an IEP for about 14 months. That child's still eligible. There was never an IEP meeting to say that they aren't. So we review that IEP. We know that if we accept that child, we're going to have to do a reevaluation right away because we need to have a current IEP in place. The other thing is if we have a PRC code, which is where the parent revoked consent, that means they've basically waived all rights to special education and the student is considered a gen ed student. And we would not, even if they had an IEP, if PRC was the exit code, we would not be obligated to review the IEP. And in fact, we cannot consider the IEP in making that decision. And we've had some cases where we've declined a kiddo because we didn't feel like we could meet their needs. Parent revoked consent. We had to review again and we couldn't consider the IEP at all, so we accepted the child. And that becomes problematic. We have one this year that we accepted and now we're doing an evaluation. So be careful with your exit codes. Make sure you have on the IEP or the change of roster what the actual exit is, because it's important to the receiving district to know to make the most appropriate decision. What questions do you have so far? All right, hearing none. Ron?
Hey, thank you. Angie, I just had one more thought related to open enrollment. Just popped into my head, and it's something that kind of comes up, in my experience, a couple times every year. If you have a student with an IEP, either that maybe it's an eligibility determination or just even an annual review, an IEP of any kind, if that student is open enrolled from a different district, always be sure you invite the resident district to your staffings. That gets forgotten a lot. And I know sometimes districts will say, oh, but I always invite the other district, but they never come. Well, that may be their choice, but then there's sometimes I guess I've experienced there's been maybe hard feelings with the resident district if they're not invited, because keep in mind what's happening when you have an open enrolled student coming to you and they're receiving special education, the resident district is getting a bill. They're getting a bill for special ed costs from your district. And I mean, they're counting that student, they're receiving funds, but it's just an important decision-making process because, maybe your IEP team is recommending a paraprofessional or equipment or something like that. And you're going to want to have, resident district representation there to be a part of that discussion. So just thought about that as a kind of a good reminder and to make sure the resident district is represented. All right.
Yep. Thank you, Ron.
You bet. Angie, would you mind unsharing and then I can grab it and then that?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Bear with us as we're talking a lot at you today, but please jump in with questions as well. just kind of a hodgepodge of these kind of what can be sometimes complex kind of situations that come up with your kids with IEPs. And one of them is competent private instruction and independent private instruction. So homeschooling. Okay, so this question of what options do families have? How do they request private instruction? Is there paperwork? How do we respond when this child has a disability? We could probably spend a whole course going through lots of obscure rules and guidelines, because this actually gets kind of complex. We linked for you, and also on the class page, there is a DE web page that has kind of all the resources for private instruction. It has the application forms, guidelines, Q&A, all those kinds of things. One thing that I think is helpful to me, there's this matrix, and I linked that here, that to me, it doesn't give us everything we need to know, but it gives us kind of at a glance some of the guidelines that govern private instruction. And I guess the first thing we wanted to mention is that there's a number of years ago, I've lost track about how many years it's been, a new ARM came in called Independent Private Instruction. Previously, everything was CPI, Competent Private Instruction. And you can kind of see at the top of this matrix that, the CPI is there. There's option 1 that can be under the supervision of a licensed practitioner or by a non-licensed practitioner. So those are both CPI. You can, so depending on how a family may choose to do CPI, some of the rules change down there as far as whether or not you have to have an annual assessment, things like that. But there's CPI, and that can be with or without a licensed practitioner. And depending on what you're doing, the families may or may not have to submit this form that districts want. So it's gotten, as you glance at this, you would see it gets a little messy. But even messier, in my opinion, is this thing called independent private instruction that came to be a number of years ago. You can see the description here. It's not accredited. That there's some guidelines here to try to describe what IPI really is. But it's you can see here the reporting. Really, the only accountability. There's no assessment accountability. You can see what it says here. The parent or guardian of a student enrolled provides, upon written request from the superintendent of the district of residence or the director of the Department of Education, a report identifying the primary instructor, the location, the name of the authority responsible for the independent instruction, and the names of the students enrolled. So what does that mean? That kind of means the parent may claim, I'm doing IPI, and if the district asks, or if the Department of Education asks, they will say, I'm doing IPI, I'm the teacher, here's what we're doing, this is where my house is, and then we're done. The family is not associated at all with the school anymore, and things kind of end right there. There's no requirement for annual assessments at all, and there's also no options for dual enrollment that we'll talk about. What we'll talk about shortly here as well. But so the IPI side of things really represents families who are completely pulling away from the school system and don't really wish to have any connections at all. So there's that. But there's also some options now. So, and again, we're talking about special education. We're talking about kids with disabilities. So, if a family says, I'd like to homeschool my child, and let's say they have an IEP, that can be with or without dual enrollment. So dual enrollment is something that can happen when a family may be doing CPI. So that means that a family may have access to some public school services, activities, classes, materials. We know that sometimes families want to dual enroll for sports and music. Sometimes they want to dual enroll for science classes because maybe they don't feel comfortable teaching those classes. But with our kids with disabilities, there also can be dual enrollment for special education. Now that's, it's kind of hard to conceptualize, what does that look like? For a handful of cases out there where I've been involved with or aware of, that could look like, for example, maybe if Johnny receives 45 minutes a day of literacy SDI, that could mean that parents will homeschool, but Johnny will come in for 45 minutes a day and get that special instruction. It could look something like that. And you can see here on the screen, there's kind of a continuum of options, either no dual enrollment, no involvement at all. It could be students continue at the same special education. It could be more limited. But I guess the bottom line is that if a family, has a student with an IEP and they're going to do homeschooling, they're going to do CPI, they can dual enroll for special education. So we do have times when the IEP team is saying, okay, so what's the IEP going to look like? We know that you're going to be homeschooling most of the time, but what might that dual enrollment look like? Okay, so we wanted to kind of clarify that is an option, and we do have students out there in Southwest Iowa that are dually enrolled for special education services, even though they're being homeschooled for the majority of their time. Also, for kids with disabilities, there is an approval process if a parent is choosing to do CPI. So whether it's fully CPI, goodbye school, we're not coming in at all, or if there's some level of dual enrollment, the AA Director of Special Education, and that's David Van Horn with our AA, is required to review that student situation and provide approval. So we have these requests coming in. David would review them, and then if and when approved, families would get a letter saying, I've reviewed the IEP for the student with your student who has a disability. You're approved to do this homeschooling, and it kind of provides parents with a list of their responsibilities and that type of thing. So that is something that still is in the rule, in the code, that there has to be this permission. It's kind of intended to be a protection, I guess, for students that have special needs. The truth is that, ultimately, families do have the right to homeschool their children, and so it'd be a very rare occasion where maybe an AA system would object or would try to stop a homeschool situation. But there is this formal approval process that's required. I was also gonna, excuse me for changing gears here. I wanted to show you a form. What I pulled up here, this is the procedures manual for special education, and I wanted to show you a form. There it is, Competent Private Instruction Worksheet. This is not a form that's in Web IEP. It's just sort of it's a form. It's a blank form, a template that the teams can use. So what is supposed to happen is if a family, if you have a student with an IEP and the family says, hey, I'm doing CPI, someone from school and or the IEP team is supposed to complete this worksheet. In a perfect world, there would be a meeting with the family saying, hey, we know your child has these IEP needs. Here's options. And so if you look here, I'll scroll down. You can see it showing some of the different options here. Dual enrollment, kind of letting families know that there's that option. Oops, sorry. We'll get back there. Dual enrollment with all special education, but with significant changes. Dual enrollment with some, but not all special ed services. Dual enrollment, maybe the parents only choosing extracurriculars or general education, or just nothing. the bottom one. I'm sorry, my mouse pad is kind of jumping around here. So it just shows that continuum of options. So the different ways CPI could go and whether or not there'll be dual enrollment. And so it's just submitted to the Director of Special Education. He used to review that and kind of get a response back to the parent. So we just wanted you to know that is something that is supposed to happen. The confusing thing is if a parent says I'm doing IPI, they don't have to do that. There's just that lesser accountability. And so if the parent is claiming IPI, there doesn't need to be that approval process. But that still is something that we are supposed to do when the parent is doing CPI. All right, one more item here. This is one more option for situations where a family is doing homeschooling. There's a homeschool assistance program. Probably a number of you have districts that do offer this. Districts are not required to have a homeschool assistance program. A lot of districts that have a good number of kids who are homeschooled do offer this program. You probably know that for homeschool students that are doing dual enrollment and or the ASAP, they get a fraction of funding. You know, I believe it's it's fairly small. It's like 1/10, but some funding does come in to districts, and they can use that funding to hire teachers. Some districts do hire a homeschool assistance program teacher, and you can see the description here that just came right out of the state website. That's a licensed teacher that's providing kind of instructional supervision of CPI. They're supposed to be 4 times per quarter contact with the student family, half of which are supposed to be face-to-face. The instructor advises the parent, they help the parents with lesson plans, materials, teaching techniques, evaluation, things like that. And notice here, HSAP is not available for under IPI. We're going to throw enough acronyms at you today to make you a little bit crazy, but that program is out there. So some families choose that. When they do choose the homeschool assistance program, the accountability is kind of with that homeschool assistance teacher, and those families aren't required to take the state assessment, for example. Many choose to do that and like to do that, but they're not required to do that. All right, in IEP world, let's talk about, what do you do with that IEP when this homeschool thing happens, okay, with your rosters and your exit codes and things like that. Well, some of the different codes that we use in IEP world, the one that's the actual code that's CPI is actually a roster change. And so when there is dual enrollment, so you might have a student who's homeschooled, but they still have an IEP via dual enrollment, the roster change becomes CPI. So there's an indication in the system that is happening. So the student still has the IEP that's probably going to look quite a bit different. But that might be that student, like I mentioned earlier, that is coming in for SDI reading or something like that. So, but they still have an IEP. They're not being exited. But if there is no dual enrollment, then we have to exit our students. So CPN is actually just the letter code that's used for that exit. So, if you're a student with an IEP, if the family says, I'm homeschooling, goodbye, I'm not coming in, I'm not dual enrolling, that IEP is exited with that CPN code, just the letters that are used there. But a reminder, that student does not lose their eligibility. Angie kind of alluded to this earlier. With the virtual academies, we sometimes get these kids coming in and there's this confusion about, they used to be homeschooled, but now they're not. But if they're exited with that CPN code, they remain eligible. So if they come back to school a month later or 6 months later, we pull them back into their IEP. They remain eligible. We also, if a family says IPI, They kind of just walk away, but they're not saying I revoke. They're just saying I'm doing independent private instruction. We also use that CPN code. Same thing. They don't lose their eligibility. This other code, though, that I know Angie mentioned earlier a little bit, is different. And sometimes it's a little bit like parsing words. It's like, PRC is parent revocation. So revocation of consent to be in special education. Parents have a right to do that. They have a right to say, I'm upset, presumably. I don't want my child to be in special education anymore. I'm revoking my consent to allow them to receive special education. If parents do that and they do it in writing, then that student is no longer eligible. So if a student walked away from their IEP after their parent revoked rights, that student would no longer be eligible. If the student shows up at school a month later, we have to do an initial evaluation and make them eligible for special education. So we start from ground zero because it's that eligibility issue. But if they're homeschooling, CPN, they remain eligible. So, and again, sometimes it's a little bit like parsing words, but if a parent uses the language of revocation, then we end up seeing that student is not eligible anymore. Okay, and I just have a screenshot here of some of these codes. These are just the exit codes here, and I just highlighted. These are some of the codes that, when we do final exits, when we remove kids from their IEPs because they're not getting services. There's a bunch of them in here. Some we rarely use, but I just highlighted there. There's that CPN one that we use for these homeschooling situations. And then the PRC is parent revoked. Those are the two that we just talked about. Let me pause. Questions about homeschooling. It gets kind of deep and gray sometimes. Any thoughts or questions out there? Or has anybody had a situation with one of their students that went to homeschooling that got messy or controversial that you would want to share as an example we could talk through?
I would just say the number of prior written notices that I review for Iowa Connections Academy in particular, sometimes it's very unclear in the prior written notice what is happening. And sometimes there seems to be a mismatch between the exit code and what's written in the prior written notice. Mm-hmm. So you may have a parent that says they're gonna do competent private instruction and they don't want special ed services anymore, and they put a CPN code, or they might put a PRC code. So, unless you're very explicit with the parent has revoked consent for all special education services in the prior written notice, we sometimes struggle knowing what we need to do. So I would just ask that you be very clear in your description so anybody picking it up can know, oh, yep, this parent revoked consent. I see that the exit code is PRC. We're clear. I know where we're at. So it's not confusing to the new reader of that IEP, because we struggle sometimes with what do we do, and then you have to make contact with the parent. What did you mean when you said this? And if it could just be clarified in the IEP initially, that would be great.
Thanks, Angie. I thought of one more thing about this topic, and then we can move on. This question just came up to me yesterday, and this happens periodically too. Sometimes we have families that are homeschooled, and the family maybe suspects a disability, and they may think, my child has a reading disability, or my child has dyslexia. And we will have parents contact the AA or the school directly and say, I understand I can get a special education evaluation. And, so really we have that same obligation to those families as we do to any family or child. We would typically do that, but we'd go through the same process of saying, what do we know? Do we suspect a disability? But that bar for suspicion, we generally keep that pretty low. So in most cases, if a family that's schooling their child says, I'd like an evaluation, unless we have a really compelling reason not to, we will typically do that evaluation. And it does get tricky and awkward sometimes because sometimes those families in no way would consider receiving special education services, but they want someone to evaluate and kind of give them information about whether or not there's a disability. So then sometimes we do identify kids, but then the family might say no thank you to services and move on. And I'm aware of a couple of cases too, just in my own experiences, where sometimes maybe the family is very content homeschooling, but they want this diagnosis, quote unquote, or this indication of a disability. And sometimes that's for their kids that may be college bound. Maybe they have a learning disability and they're wanting some level of accommodation. So we have sometimes tricky situations like that, trying to figure out, how to do that. But bottom line, we're obligated to do the evaluations, but and just kind of walk through that.
Hey, Ron?
Yes.
Ron, I'm going to play timekeeper, and we've got 15 minutes.
You bet. And I wonder if we're going to get through that last topic at all.
Well, I don't know if we should skip to the last topic and save the records for next time.
Why don't we do that? That's a great idea, Angie, because
Okay.
if we jump over that, and then we can, because our last topic was going to maybe get us a little bit more interactive, and that would probably be a good thing at 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. What we wanted to do, we want to talk about dispute resolution, and this will be a good lead into the next time we meet too, because we're gonna try to put together some more legal topics, and this matrix that you see in front of you here is kind of a nice summary of the different levels of dispute resolution. So. And what we mean by dispute resolution is when families disagree or have concerns about a disability issue or about an IEP decision or about an eligibility decision. There's different roads that they can go, to walk through resolving that difference with the district or with the AEA. And this chart kind of shows the different tiers here. And we wanted you guys as veterans to be aware of all these. And we wanted to give you a few minutes, maybe put you in breakout groups to talk about it. But Angie, what's the best? What do you think is the best prompt we can give them? Do we want to jigsaw? Do we want to try to have them?
I think we had kind of decided where we wanted you to just kind of review the features of each dispute resolution process and kind of what stands out to you about the differences between them. And then if you've been, and be prepared to talk about that when you come back. And then if you've been involved in a dispute, kind of what process was used and how did it go? What were your thoughts about it? So it was kind of twofold. Review it, see what stands out, and then if you've been in one, be prepared to kind of talk about that. Does that work?
Good. That sounds good. So everybody okay with that? Kind of read, review, talk about the tiers, and maybe share if you've been through part of this process, and we can talk about it as a large group when we get back. So, and we'll leave this up on the screen here. I can put you into breakout groups, and I think you guys remember how this worked before. It's just going to kind of put you in the. Looks like we have just 15 people today. Groups of.
You want to do 5 groups?
Yeah. How about groups of 3? Okay. So I'm going to create that. And so that's going to send you there right away. And let's bring you back in. Angie, what do you think about
Just 5 or 6 minutes.
5 or 6 minutes? Okay. We're going to send you there. Here we go.
Breakout room 5.
Look at my eyeballs. Look at it. Look at it. Really good. Oh, yeah. Look at my eyeballs. Look at it. Look at it. Really good. Oh, yeah. Look at my eyeballs. Look at it. Look at it. Really good. Oh, yeah. Look at my eyeballs. Look at it. Look at it. Really good. Oh, yeah.
Oh, she got here.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Howdy.
So what jumped out to you?
In our group, we neither one of us had been through any of this, so we were grateful.
Uh-huh.
But we were both familiar with the due process level as far as we knew people or school districts that had gone through this before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that none of us want to. We want to stop at the AEA mediation level if at all possible.
Yeah, definitely. And I think most of the AEA's regional administrators, as well as a few others, have been through advanced mediation. And in fact, we're all taking a course, or most of us are taking a course later this month to kind of review the process and hone our skills even better. But yeah, I was telling my group, and my group had only been maybe a part of an AEA mediation, but I've been a part of everything but the due process hearing and the mediation request for hearing. I've had multiple situations where a state mediator has been appointed, and now they'll appoint 2 per case so they can kind of support each other. And they're not always fun, and sometimes they take hours and hours or 2 or 3 meetings. But most of the time you can come to an agreement that's followed, and it does help that relationship with the school. I think Thomas would tell you that he's never had a situation where there's a good relationship with the school that's gone to dispute resolution. So making sure you've got a real strong connection and relationship with that family can go a long ways. Just very quickly, I could tell you about one of the ones that I had recently where there were attorneys involved. We had to submit all the IEPs and, you know, all the documentation that we had to the attorneys. And we had our tech director and the school district's tech director had to like search through all of our Google files and our Google Mail and find anything with that kiddo's name on it. And that was a part of the child's educational record. And so we had to print all of those out and send them to both attorneys. And in this particular situation, there was information on from AEA personnel to the school personnel that said, I have a concern that the school district or the teacher is not implementing the IEP, and went on to describe what that was. And I can tell you when the AEA and LEA attorney, because we usually have one attorney for both, saw that, they're like, you guys need to settle. Because it was a situation where parent had alleged that school district was not implementing the IEP as written, and then there was documentation that the AEA had also seen that and was, talking with the district about it. So it was immediately, let's try to settle this. So be careful what you write, be careful what you put in writing. That can come back to haunt you in some cases, but it could be requested. All those emails, and Ron might get a chance to talk about it next time, but if you're using your phone to text to the parent, that could become a part of an educational record. But certainly we do try to offer up the least formal process to parents when they call and have a question. Get it resolved at that level if we can. And we've had a lot of success with that too. And the AEA can mediate situations that aren't like this. I mean, with our mediation training, we could mediate between, two principals that are having issue, a principal and a parent, or a principal and a teacher. We could be asked to do something outside of special education, but we rarely are at this point. What questions do you have about dispute resolution, or has anybody been involved in anything other than what we've already talked about? Michelle, I'll put you on. Have you, I know your district has had some stuff in the past, but I don't know that you've been involved in it.
No, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I have never been involved in anything like that, thankfully.
Yeah, I think yours was a very low level case, and that it was years ago. Wasn't anything recent. Yeah. Oftentimes, what happens with the state complaint is when that comes to the AEA and the school district with, these are the areas of concern. I know in the past I have spent countless hours researching each of the areas of concern so I can put together a thoughtful response. Like parents said, blah, 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 blah. So I'll go pull IEPs. I will request emails on my own. I'll, notes, whatever. And I will try to respond to that complaint with what we have, because oftentimes, what parents say isn't quite fully the truth. There may be some truth to it, but so it takes countless hours to go through and do that, to come up with a response with each of the questions. And then that's reviewed by usually the attorney to make sure it makes sense, and then with the school, and then we send that back to Thomas. And then he uses that to help make his recommendation. And so that's a lot of work within that 60-day time frame. I've only had one of those, luckily, and it wasn't fun. None of it's fun, actually. But yeah, this is helpful. If you're coming on a situation where you have a concern, certainly pull this out. This is on the DE website. Share it with your principal, share it with your superintendent or whomever. Have to give us a call. We certainly would work with you to try to work it out at the lowest level of this process as possible. We can be very helpful with that. And again, keeping good relationships with families is highly important. Once this is over, you still often have to work with that family for a number of years. So try to create and maintain those positive relationships, and some trust, which might have to be built again, is very important. Any other questions for the good of the cause? All right, well, I think we've run out of time, so we'll cover records next time, and then go into some legal issues. If you, as always, if you have any thoughts you'd like to have us address in terms of a legal nature, just send them to either Ron or me, and we'll make sure we try to cover those next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
You as well.
Bye. Bye, Ron.
Bye.